Hello, everyone. So this is part two of the media lecture. So first of all, just an explanation for the costume change. So unfortunately, the second part of the lecture that we had on Thursday didn't record from Zoom. It turns out there's a bit of a technical issue when I do when to take a break in the middle to watch a video. If it's too short, doesn't have time to download properly, yada, yada, yada. So Zoom didn't record the second half, unfortunately, which is obviously very frustrating. So I'm going to do a recap right now of everything we talked about to the best of my ability. There was some really great conversation from your classmates, and unfortunately that I can't recreate, but I do have my notes, so I will do my best to kind of summarize those points. And then moving forward, I'm just going to kind of handle the video days a little differently when we watch a movie together, so this doesn't happen again. And I'm going to silence my phone. I already know. Okay, so just give me a moment to share my screen. So you've just watched the episode of Modern Family: The Kiss. If you haven't already done that, I would say do that right now, just because this is largely about deconstructing that. And then towards the end of this video, I'll also talk to you about your media review assignment and my rubric for doing that. Okay. Share my screen. Share. Slide. Okay, so before the break, I shared these questions with you, and I wanted you to kind of consider these things while you were watching the episode. What are the gender tropes represented in Modern Family? And consider tropes that we talked about in the brand reading, and also that I shared in the first half of this lecture. What are the range of roles available to women on the show? How is masculinity portrayed on the show? And how does ethnicity intersect with gender on the show? So when we came back from the break, I asked the students who were synchronous, to just take a minute and to jot down their thoughts on, one of these ideas, and then they all in breakout rooms, they had a small discussion and share what they kind of thought. There were some really good points that I will repeat to the best of my ability. I'm going to go character by character. So I let the students kind of give me their thoughts, and then I kind of like went through. What was really great is so many of the thoughts that I was going to point out, students had already pointed out. And to be completely honest, there were some things that I hadn't even noticed that people pointed out, which is always really cool for me as a teacher. So I'm going to go character by character. So first character I want to talk about in terms of gender representation is Claire. And Claire, I really wanted to focus on, and a little peek behind the curtain. When I was, a reason that I selected Modern Family as a case study for this was thinking about Claire as an evolution of the kind of mom as warden character. And also Claire as a feminist killjoy. And when I was trying to pick an episode. I spent much of last week binging Modern Family to find an episode before I picked The Kiss. And I texted a few friends and said, like, I'm looking for an episode of Modern Family to teach. And I'm looking for something that really shows like Claire kind of at her peak, like feminist killjoy. And I had about 3 different friends respond to say, like, I think that's just every episode, which fair. So, I mean, in the very first scene of the episode we just watched, we get a great little microcosm for the family dynamic of the Dunphys. Claire is organizing a set of Tupperware and frustrated that the lids don't match, trying to kind of create order. She's kind of questioning Phil where the lids went. Phil kind of just makes a joke and starts like playing with puns. And then Alex comes in and says, like, I need books. So like that's really the family dynamic and something we get a lot in the episode. And someone also pointed out in class just the fact that Phil makes a joke about, the lids as a couple who have split up, and the idea that the female Tupperware part was trying to contain the man, and that is a great little metaphor for Claire. So these images, it was really not very hard to find pictures of Claire looking grumpy, because her character really, she's portrayed very much as this kind of disciplinary figure. Phil is kind of a man-child who's often trying to, like have little side adventures or do things that are much more based in play and fun. He really doesn't act like a father to his kids a ton, and very often self-referentially will talk about wanting to be more of a friend than a parent. And that kind of leaves Claire by default to be sometimes feel like a single parent. She often mothers Phil. A lot of her plots, even outside the home, are about her trying to control and act as a disciplinary figure to the neighborhood, to the community. Someone pointed out that there's even a scene towards the end of the episode where Cam, they're at Jay and Gloria's house, and Cam kind of falls over the couch, spills some chips, and instantly Claire runs in to start cleaning. So that Claire's kind of Claire's character is really defined by her as an agent of control and caretaking and mothering. And generally, yeah, it is always really at odds with the concept of fun, and she becomes a figure of conflict for the show. And the fact that Claire is portrayed as an intelligent, strong woman, and the fact that an intelligent, strong woman always has to be kind of the antithesis of fun. So the next character we looked at is Gloria. So one thing I was hoping people would see in terms of the reading is Gloria is kind of an extension of what Brand calls the Daffy house. The Daffy housewife or the Daffy mother. Gloria is portrayed as really fun and kind of kooky. A lot of this is either tied, usually in overlapping ways, to her sexuality or to her ethnic identity. Gloria is from Colombia. So one person pointed, so very often there's a lot of conflict that comes from her expressing her culture, usually in pretty comic ways. And either her husband, Jay, who's both older and an American, white, not respecting or understanding her culture, and also her son, Manny, kind of losing touch with his culture. So a lot of Gloria's plot lines do kind of circle around her culture, but are usually pretty silly about it. So in this episode, Gloria is making her grandmother's traditional recipe in honor of her late grandmother. And Jay's disrespecting her, and she kind of tricks him into like performing all these like arbitrary, silly rituals. Someone pointed out in the class, one of the students, I thought this was great, the fact that like Gloria's culture is often, and very much in this episode, is expressed in food. So that Gloria's sense of cultural identity is expressed in very specifically domestic ways. And that actually does come up quite a bit in the show, is that very often when Gloria is performing her ethnic identity, it is through some kind of maternal domestic trope. Gloria is also kind of coded as a very stereotypical Latin character. Gloria is very often seen as very hot-headed, has like a short fuse, very aggressive, always in kind of a funny way that's a little over the top and often at odds with her like her beauty. She's also, there's a lot of jokes that are fairly racist about Gloria, being involved in organized crime, that a lot of the Colombian traditions are kind of cliches about the mafia, that there's a lot of jokes about her growing up in poverty and just how poor her village was and how that's very, very funny. Visually, Gloria is coded as being very hypersexualized. An interesting contrast between Gloria and Claire is that Claire is usually wears kind of like sweat clothes or button-down shirts. So her femininity is very like kind of minimal and functional, and they actually do a fair amount to make this like beautiful actress appear, if not frumpy, that she kind of like doesn't have time for beauty. Whereas Gloria is usually wearing, Gloria wears a lot of leopard, which is a cultural code in the West for kind of female sexuality. And kind of like an abundance of female sexuality, usually kind of kitschy. Gloria also wears just a lot of like bright colors and kind of low-cut dresses. Her body is often the subject of conversation. And she is, she's a lot more fun than Claire, and usually does get portrayed as kind of like silly and goofy in a very sexual way. Alex is, so a part of this episode talks about Alex trying to, Alex has a crush on a boy she's been texting with, her mom is getting over involved, she needs to kiss him, so no one thinks she's a lesbian. That's not great. So again, Alex really, exemplifies the feminist killjoy type. Alex's thing is being extremely smart and not participating in a lot of kind of feminine social rituals. She doesn't like wearing dresses. She's always holding a book. There's a lot of scenes where she is kind of making fun of Haley for being unintelligent and feminine and overly social. And yeah, there's a great episode where Alex has been away for the summer and they're having the best summer ever. And then she comes home and everything kind of falls apart because just her presence sucks the fun out of the room. Alex has a ton of relationships with boys, and certainly in this episode, they actually Haley actually implies that Alex's failure to perform femininity gets read as lesbianism, and then that's something she should avoid, which again, the optics are pretty terrible. Yeah, so I mean, I do think Alex is, even though Alex doesn't necessarily constantly talk about literal feminist politics, Alex is really ambitious in like STEM fields. Alex is generally very like scholastic, talks about college a lot, goes to college, is very ambitious, is focused on career, and tends to kind of shun beauty rituals, romantic interests. And that all gets coded around that Alex is the antithesis of fun, which is really typical of the feminist killjoy trope in media. Conversely, Haley is coded as kind of the party animal. Haley is Haley gets a lot of screen time devoted to kind of her beauty, her sexuality, her relationships. Haley has the most like number of different kind of romantic interests throughout the show, and she kind of becomes the protagonist of the younger generation. She gets much more screen time than her cousins or siblings or Manny, who's technically her uncle. A lot of Haley's plots actually kind of revolve around like making poor decisions, though. Haley gets kicked out of college for drinking. Haley does in later seasons gets pregnant, and she's not married. So there's Claire has kind of a reaction to that as Haley. There's an ongoing plot of or a thread of Haley kind of repeating the mistakes of Claire's youth, even though Claire's adult life is incredibly stable. So I mean, this kind of constant thread of Claire trying to shield Haley from her own mistakes, to me never feels super sincere, just because why wouldn't Haley want why wouldn't Claire want Haley to turn out like her, because she's done pretty well. A lot of Haley's femininity is put at odds with intelligence. So the fact that Haley is like fun and sexy is often played off with her being not very bright. And there's an interesting, we talked in class about the fact that a lot of times Haley is actually kind of treated as a cautionary tale, even though the show does kind of sugarcoat that and doesn't necessarily completely admonish Haley. It would not be, you would not have to change much about the show to make Haley's narrative like fairly dark and more of a kind of traditional cautionary tale, because it does tend to treat a lot of her decisions as punitive. We talked about Cameron and Mitchell. One of the main plots of this episode is that Mitchell does not like to kiss Cameron in public and really even just around other people. So we did talk about the gender roles that the two portray. So despite the fact that they are a same-sex couple, they're both gay, they're both men, they're both identified as cis men. The way they're portrayed in terms of gender is pretty binary and pretty rigid. Cameron is the stay-at-home dad. Cameron typically displays a lot of features of like a stereotypical stay-at-home mom. Cameron is very emotional. Cameron is really interested in shopping, in fashion. He's really into party planning. A lot of their plots are about Cameron being over the top and Mitchell trying to kind of like rein him in. Mitchell is a lawyer. Mitchell is a lot more emotionally distant. We can actually see a lot of parallels actually between the dynamic between Jay and Gloria and Mitch and Cam. Mitchell, there are some like interesting attempts by the writers to diversify this a bit, and to me these always are a little disingenuous. So for example, Mitch is fairly athletic and talks a lot about the fact that he played football in high school and college, and that he is pretty good at sports, and that's always played off as this kind of like surprising detail where it's like, ooh, I really like buck the stereotype of gay men not being good at sports. But I mean, I find it to be so tacked on, and the rest of Cameron's personality is so like kind of a by the numbers like feminization. And I mean, this also connects to a concept called heteronormativity, the assumption that gay couples or gay individuals do need to kind of map their identities and experience onto a straight template. You know, a kind of stereotype of heteronormative language would be asking a straight couple which one of you is the woman, which assumes that a couple is always functioning in a male-female binary, that gender roles need to be kind of respected, and that when a gay couple or a queer couple kind of come together, that they need to kind of find a way to work within that binary and adopt heterosexuality as the norm. So heteronormative. Another thing we kind of talked about before I get to Jay, someone also brought up Phil, which I hadn't flagged Phil as a character to discuss, only because there were so many characters on the show. But there's one of the plots of this episode, kind of the subplot, is that Jay is fixing, that Jay can't work his computer printer, and so Phil comes over to fix it with him, and he works too hard to kind of impress Jay, and that's kind of their dynamic. So Jay very much cannot admit that he doesn't know how to do something. There is an interesting dynamic between Phil and Jay around masculinity on the show. I'll switch to Jay, where Jay is kind of portrayed as this like very traditional form of masculinity, whereas you know, he's good at working with his hands, he's good at business, he's very good at kind of like hardware things. But is terrible at computers, which is often described to his age. He can't double click is a running gag. He goes like click, click, and then goes double click. Whereas Phil is really good with technology. And so often this is played off as a gender thing, and the idea that Phil is a little more tagged into like youth culture. The thing is, so in this episode, Phil comes over to fix Jay's computer, and he brings along, someone pointed out that he brings along Luke, and this kind of becomes a male bonding ritual because Manny also gets involved. So the men are fixing stuff. It's still, even though Phil, in terms of like his positionality to Jay, is being coded as less traditionally masculine, you know, Phil is still fixing. Phil is still taking on the job of if not physical labor, maintenance of some kind, which again is a very masculine coded thing. Someone pointed out in the class that like it makes no sense that Alex isn't called over because Alex is quite literally a computer genius. But Alex is not called to fix a computer because that would be a very masculine thing, and her intelligence tends to kind of happen in a bubble in isolation. She doesn't kind of use it to help people, and she doesn't use it to teach her siblings or her family members. Yeah, so the fact that Phil's plot here is about like fixing is still very much coded in the masculine. So that's an interesting dynamic between them. Jay is a character, someone pointed out in class, which I absolutely loved. The plot here is about kissing. That's why it's called The Kiss. And they reason that one of the reasons that Mitch is afraid to express emotion is that he's gotten this from Jay. And Jay's famously bad at feelings. That's kind of his thing on the show, is him kind of being at odds with expressing emotion, and him kind of reluctantly learning to do a little better. And he has a moment where he talks about the fact that, that as bad as he is at emotion, his dad was 10 times worse, and his dad never said he loved him or kissed him. And so someone in class pointed out that Jay kind of describes this idea that this form of masculinity and this kind of like patriarchal stifling of feelings and emotions is passed down. It's kind of like a paternal lineage thing. So there's an intergenerational, and there's like kind of a tradition component, which I thought was a great observation that I had missed. Jay's kind of role in the family dynamic is the most traditionally masculine. One thing that I think is really interesting about Jay, and I've noticed this in a couple of sitcoms of the last decade or so, kind of starting around the late 2000s, is criticisms of patriarchy that are like, but are they criticisms? So again, Jay, I mean, everyone kind of has their foibles on Modern Family, and Jay certainly is that he's a very old school patriarch, and that makes him like bad at feelings. Jay is also still very coded as a very lovable character. Jay's very intelligent, but in a really well-rounded way. His intelligence is kind of very like more about wisdom than smarts. There's an episode where he and Alex are playing Words with Friends or something similar, and Alex can't believe that he's beating her, and he just kind of like takes her aside, and he says like, you're not really the smartest one of the family, maybe one day you will be, but I'm still pretty darn smart. but in a very kind of like business, salt of the earth kind of way. Yeah, so even though Jay's kind of like foible or like gag is being this slightly out of touch patriarch, the show really rewards him. It often shows him as quite loving and willing to change, um, uh, in a way that the other foibles are not. I don't think Claire's kind of like angry feminism is treated as lovingly. Gloria's kind of like exoticization is certainly not as humanized as much. Whereas Jay's grappling with emotion is, he's rewarded a lot for trying, he's celebrated, and even at his most kind of emotionally distant, there is a very loving quality to the way he's portrayed and the way people receive him. And this connects, I think, to, again, a larger pattern that I've noticed that I just wanted to point out here. So some other characters who kind of are introduced as parodies or criticisms of patriarchy are Ron Swanson on Parks and Rec, Captain Holt on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Jack Donaghy on 30 Rock, and just for fun, I threw in Rick from Rick and Morty. Jay's also there. So for example, I'll use Ron. I feel like Ron's a very popular example, where Ron really is introduced as a satire of this like patriarchal hyper-masculine figure. He's a libertarian, so he's extremely anti-government. He's kind of over the top with self-reliance. He doesn't have feelings. He refused to eat fruit and vegetables. You know, he's like bacon and whiskey for every meal. He doesn't believe in like feelings or allergies. He's kind of a survivalist. So he's this really like lives in a log cabin, refuses to tell anyone his address, won't tell anyone his birthday, doesn't want anyone to get close. And he's depicted as kind of the foil for the main character, Leslie. And Leslie is, extremely progressive, liberal, very in touch with feelings and emotion, cares about everything. And even though Ron is depicted as this, it's kind of a satire of patriarch. He's such a lovable character. Ron is so popular in pop culture. People love Nick Offerman for this role. And the show does actually end up, like not so much critiquing masculinity as finding a way, to make it funny while still kind of celebrating it. The Brant reading talks about the idea of retrosexuality and the idea of kind of reclaiming sexist tropes. And it talks about them more in terms of like very traditionally sexist characters. Generally speaking, most of the patriarch characters are not depicted as sexist, and Ron goes out of his way to talk about how he really likes strong women, and most of the, he ends up dating Lucy Lawless, who played Xena, and that's kind of like a wink to the camera. And so they do actually go out of their way. A lot of these characters do this to sidestep overt sexism, while still kind of reveling in a lot of stereotypes about the patriarchy. And I think while this is often pitched as a way for the shows to be more self-aware about patriarchal roles, I would argue that there is still something in our culture, in the way that we are living in a patriarchal culture, where a patriarch is not quite disavowed. These characters are more complicated and acknowledged as being flawed, and yet we still love those flaws. Captain Raymond Holt is like almost, stoic to the point where it's cartoonish, like does not express an emotion, is so formal. But everyone loves him and sees him as a father, and everyone kind of wants to be him. The character of Morty on Rick and Morty, is really an over-the-top kind of terrible person, and is extremely kind of a toxic father figure. And there's been a lot of discussion in kind of fan culture and the geek culture on the way that Rick is supposed to, Rick is not supposed to be a role model. Rick is supposed to be something of a cautionary tale, and yet by virtue of being the protagonist, and despite the fact that he's just kind of written in such a fun way, he ends up being a role model and being aspirational. And I think this is like a major difference if you look at kind of critical patriarchs versus feminist killjoys, is that while both are technically critiques of those types, critical patriarchs are fun and people kind of want to be them. I don't think anyone really wants to be Claire Dunphy. That's not true. Maybe people do want to be Claire Dunphy, and there might be people who are kind of reclaiming that role. But I think you have to do a lot more work to have fun with Claire, whereas these patriarchal characters are written in a way that they just kind of get celebrated. even though they're maybe written as a criticism. So I think that's super interesting. So that kind of ended our discussion of Modern Family and of tropes, and hopefully shows you how you can take a piece of pop culture, like an episode of a TV show, and apply some of the analytical tools we've done in lecture to a specific topic. So for your media response that you're going to do for Monday, I want you to do exactly that. So here are the questions again. These are the same questions I gave you for Modern Family. I've just taken out the word Modern Family. I'd like you to use them for a piece of pop culture you decide. So you can pick an episode of a TV show, a movie, music video, meme, like truly anything. Pick something you're interested in. It can be something you really like. It can be something that really actually pisses you off, because sometimes being frustrated by something is quite generative. Or you can do what I did and pick something that you have really mixed feelings about. Like I watched a lot of seasons of Modern Family, and I also recognize that it's really problematic because I have a complicated relationship to sitcoms. And that is that's a really generative place. I'm going to talk about that a lot more when I talk about RuPaul's Drag Race about last week and my complicated relationship to that piece of media. But jumping ahead, my point is pick something you like and answer these questions. So you should look at one, maybe two of these questions. Do not answer all of them. I'll read them again. So what are gender tropes? What gender tropes are represented in your example? And consider tropes covered in the brand reading. You can also look at some of the tropes I've covered in today's lecture, both part 1 and 2. What range of roles are available to women on the show or whatever piece of media you are analyzing? How is masculinity portrayed? You might also want to look at the way patriarchy is portrayed, if it is. It probably is. And then how does ethnicity or race intersect with gender and gender roles? So you might, if you do see something, something that you kind of recognize as a form of exoticism. Very often exoticism is kind of the intersection of sexualization and a form of racism. And Gloria is, I think, a pretty good example of that. One suggestion I had for the class, which I will repeat, is you can pick absolutely anything. I would, if you're not sure what to do and you're feeling a little unsure about the assignment, I think an episode of a TV show is great because well, one, we've done an episode of a show together, and that might make it a little easier for you to use this lecture as a template for your own writing. A TV show is also will kind of give you more to work with because TV has a mix of images, narrative, and text, whereas say like a music video or a meme might not have narrative and text. So you have a little more to work with on a TV show, but a TV show is usually shorter. A movie is quite long, and you might find that you have kind of too much to cover in only 500 words. If you're going to do a movie, I would, and you can, if you have a movie in mind, that's fine. I came very close to showing Mad Max for this lecture, and I didn't. But if you're going to do a movie, I would suggest focusing on one scene or one character or a way to try and encapsulate it. Like, don't try and cover a whole 2-hour movie in 500 words. And even with a TV show, again, like pick one concept. So if I were going to write a media response on this episode of Modern Family, I would pick, I would probably just write about Claire, or I would probably write about Gloria. I would pick one thing. 500 words is not enough. Please don't write on this episode of Modern Family because we've already done this together. So pick something of your own. But yeah, do feel free to use a TV show if that feels easier. And if you have any questions about you're not quite sure what to decide, you can email me over the next couple of days. In terms of the format, so this should be written in paragraph format. So like kind of a short essay. You do not need a thesis, and you do not need to cite, but it should be like full sentences and paragraphs. Do not write point form. And again, focus on 1 or 2 questions. So you're not going through and answering all of these questions. Do not do that. Pick 1 or 2. And try and narrow in on a specific aspect of the show or piece of media that shows one of these things. And obviously look for a piece of media that engages with the gender in a way that is fairly obvious, like make it easier on yourselves. So yeah, you will write this in a Word document. It will be in full sentences. It will be in kind of paragraph format. Keep in mind, 500 words is not a ton of space, so don't try and cover too much. and you should upload it as a, if you can, as a Word document to Moodle by the end of the day on Monday. I'll get to that in a second. This is, I use a rubric. I think a rubric is really helpful in just communicating to you what I'm looking for and how your grade is a reflection of that. You know, if you are, I'll start with B, because I think a B range is kind of a good place to start talking about what a grade is. So if you're getting in the B range, which ranges from 70 to 79, this means that you are, for me, meeting the expectations of the assignment. You're grasping the subject matter. There is some evidence of critical thinking and analyzing. So you're not just summarizing the text, you're actually like analyzing it. So you're doing the analytical part of the assignment. You have an understanding of the issues around them. And I can tell from reading it that you're familiar with the literature that you're reading. I had a lot of questions, and before I kind of shared my rubric with people, I found that I got the most questions around 70s. And one question I got very often from someone who hadn't written for a university class before, or someone who might be coming from another discipline, like someone coming from sciences would often ask this question, which is, I did exactly why you asked for, why did I only get a B? That's a really good question, and here's the thing. In the humanities, at a university level, getting an A or higher actually means you've exceeded expectations. So we doing just as asked for is good. It means you're hitting all the points of the class, and that's a B. An A actually means that you've gone above and beyond. So B means that you have kind of like a really strong grasp, not just of the material, but of original thinking. You're producing wholly original ideas. You are able to synthesize information, and synthesis is when you kind of take two points or two pieces of information and you can compare and contrast them to kind of create something new. Your knowledge base is extensive. Again, it's beyond the kind of, not minimum, but like the standard for the class. And I think that's definitely a difference if you're coming, because this is a first year class, if you're coming from a high school writing environment, usually in high school, an A means that you've done exactly what I've asked. Whereas at a university level, A means that you've exceeded and that you're slightly above the baseline, whereas a B is like you're doing exactly what you should be doing. I've also gotten questions from students coming from the sciences. If someone gets a 75, they will say, where did I lose 25 marks? In the humanities, it's actually not about losing. There's not like a hypothetical flawless paper and then you get marks taken away for each mistake you made. It is more about the grade is there to communicate to me like what level you're writing at. A high B will probably have very little technical writing errors in it, and A should have essentially like no technical errors. A B probably has very little, maybe one or two typos is acceptable, but it is really not about making mistakes. It's about where your level of comprehension and analysis is. So, I mean, a big part of university writing, and certainly in a first year course, one thing I'm trying to communicate as a priority is that you're moving beyond just kind of summarizing. If you're simply summarizing the readings and you're just kind of like reciting back to me things I've said, like that's great, but that's probably a low B. This now is about you being able to create your own forms of knowledge. So original thinking and synthesis, rather than just summarizing, rather than just summarizing the texts. Towards the lower end, if you're generally getting the stuff, but there are maybe more than a few errors, the subject matter is, you get the general idea of things, but it's maybe like not as detailed as I'd like. It's a little vague. That's kind of more in a C range. If you're kind of, between 50 and 59, which is a D, increasingly vague, maybe a lot of errors in the writing. You've mentioned a few key topics and you're kind of in the right direction, but you need to engage more thoroughly, more specifically. It needs to be longer, it needs to be more detailed. And then, below 50 means that you're not meeting the requirements for this assignment. So it might be too short. The analysis might just not be thorough enough at all. It's too brief, it's too superficial, or you're fundamentally not kind of grasping the concept of some of the key issues. So yeah, so that is your media response, and you will again hand that in for Monday. If you have questions, please email me. Um, uh, Next week, we are moving on to the theme next week is gender and justice. So we're looking at intersectionality on Monday. And as we go on, we're looking at like colonialism, violence, health. I will say that next week's classes do deal with some pretty intense topics. And some of the topics can be triggering. So do take a look at the headings. We're watching two films. One film, the film we were watching the week on colonialism, Canada's Dark Secret is about the residential school system in Canada. And this is a pretty upsetting subject matter. I thank you for engaging with this difficult material. I understand that it will be difficult. So if you are more tentative about sharing discussion questions publicly, that's fine. If there is a reading that you're really uncomfortable and that it is triggering, I understand, and you obviously as an adult have the autonomy to choose not to engage with something. If you find that there's like more than 2 readings that you really can't engage with next week, I would say come talk to me and we will talk about a way for you to engage with the class in a way that works for you. But I mean, if it's one reading and you're just like, I can't go there, that's really fine. In a 12-week class in which each week has about 2 or 3 readings, one reading is not a deal breaker. So, again, everyone here's an adult. I trust that you know how to make a decision on what you can and will engage with, and I respect that choice. But yeah, if you have any questions about that, please reach out to me. I look forward to reading your media responses. Again, your first reading response was technically due yesterday, but because of the grace period, as long as you hand it in today, there will be no penalties. And on Monday, I am also going to talk about the term paper for the final assignment, final in-class assignment rather. And so make sure you tune into that. And thank you so much and have a great weekend. And thank you so much for a great first week. It's a very intense class. We covered a month worth of material in 4 days. I really appreciate all the good work everyone's doing. And yeah, have a really good weekend. Okay, bye.